My name is Eliza Warren, and I was 12 years old the first time I understood that a family can throw away more than objects. They can throw away evidence. Evidence that you were loved. Evidence that you belonged. Evidence that you ever mattered in that house at all. If this story resonates with you, subscribe only if you mean it. And as you listen, tell me where you're watching from. Because I've learned something over the years. Pain travels, but so does truth. The summer, my parents threw away all my belongings, began like the kind of summer people later describe as ordinary. It wasn't ordinary to me. I grew up in a narrow, two-story house outside Columbus, Ohio. With aluminum siding that rattled during storms and a front porch, my father always meant to repaint but never did. My mother, Denise, believed in appearances more than comfort. She kept the front flower beds neat, polished the good silver for holidays we barely enjoyed, and spoke about our family as if she were writing a catalog description for a life she wished she had ordered from somewhere better. My father, Clark, was quieter. He sold commercial roofing supplies and had the kind of tired politeness that made strangers trust him. To the outside world, he looked dependable. Inside our house, he specialized in a softer kind of absence. He rarely started the harm. He just cleared his throat and let it happen. Then there was my older brother, Mason. Mason was 3 years older than me and was born, I think, with a kind of face that invited excuses. Teachers called him spirited when he was rude. Coaches called him competitive when he was cruel. My mother called him sensitive when he broke things and expected other people to apologize for being upset. I was the opposite. I was neat, quiet, good at school. The sort of child adults praised in that distracted voice people use when they are already looking over your shoulder for someone more interesting. I learned very early that being easy to manage is not the same thing as being valued. Some families have one golden child and one scapegoat. We had one son and one attic. Mason was the son. Everything in our house bent toward him. I was where things got stored. The older I got, the more I understood my place through small moments. The extra scoop of ice cream he got after mocking me at dinner. The way my mother said, "Don't make this a thing." Whenever I pointed out something obvious and unfair, the way my father would look at me with a face that almost said, "I know," then lower his eyes and say nothing at all. But my room was mine. It was small, angled under the roofline, with one narrow window overlooking the side yard and a maple tree that turned fiery orange every October. The wallpaper had faint blue flowers on it from before we moved in. And even though my mother said it looked childish, I liked it. In the late afternoon, the light in that room turned honey-colored, and dust floated through it like tiny sparks. It smelled like library books, Leonard hand cream, pencil shavings, and, in winter, the metal heat from the old radiator under the window. Everything important to me lived in that room. My books with my notes in the margins. The ceramic music box my grandmother Ruth had given me when I was 7. A shoebox of letters. Ticket stubs. Camp bracelets. A stack of sketch pads. A faded yellow quilt my grandmother had sewn by hand. And one old wooden box with a brass latch that looked so plain, nobody in our family ever noticed it. That box had belonged to my grandmother, too. She was my mother's mother. And she was the only adult in my childhood who saw me clearly enough to call me by the right shape of myself. Grandma Ruth never said things like, "You're the easy one," as if that were a compliment. She said, "You notice things other people miss?" She said, That is not a burden unless you let blind people define what sight is. She said, keep what matters. Most people lose their lives in pieces because they let other people sort through them. I didn't understand that last one when I was 10. I understood it perfectly by 12. Inside that wooden box were papers, dried flowers, a silver charm bracelet with one missing clasp, and a slim leather portfolio tied with a cord. My grandmother had told me to keep the portfolio safe and not let my mother reorganize it into oblivion. Her exact words: "Your mother confuses tidiness with wisdom." I loved her for that. The portfolio held old sketches and handwritten notes from a man named Edwin Vale, who had rented a room from my great-grandparents decades earlier when he was young and unknown, and trying to paint for department stores and magazine ads. To me, at 12, that meant almost nothing. To my grandmother, it meant memory. She told me he had become successful later. Not wildly famous, like the kind of artist people wear on museum tote bags, but respected enough that collectors paid serious money for his early work. She said the papers might matter one day. Then she looked at me over her glasses and added, "And even if they don't, they matter because I said they do." That was Grandma Ruth. Practical 1 second, holy the next. She died in March, 4 months before the summer camp trip. Her death left the world sounding wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. The clock in the kitchen sounded rude. My mother's voice sounded sharper, as though grief had taken the little padding off her words and exposed the blade underneath. My mother cried beautifully after the funeral. That is not a nice thing to say about your own mother. But it is true. Her crying looked expensive. It came in controlled waves. She pressed tissues under her lashes instead of against them. She received sympathy like flowers at a banquet. I cried in my room with my face in my quilt until I couldn't breathe. I stopped eating for a while. Then I started hiding food. Then I got good grades, because good grades were the one pain response adults still rewarded. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Mason got into trouble at school for punching another boy in the locker room. My mother insisted it was stress. The boy had apparently provoked him by asking whether he had cheated on a science test. That same week, our church youth group announced a 2-week summer camp in Michigan. I did not want to go. I had never liked loud cabins, forced trust falls, or girls who brought 3 curling irons into the woods. But my guidance counselor encouraged it, saying it would be good for me after my grandmother died. Even my father said, fresh air might help. What he meant was that my sadness had become inconvenient in the house. My mother was weirdly enthusiastic. "You need this?" she said, standing in my doorway and looking around my room with an expression I would only understand later. "You've gotten too attached to things." Things. That was her word for evidence, her word for grief, her word for anything she could not control without sounding cruel. I remember packing the night before camp. The air was heavy and warm. There was no storm yet. But the sky had that bruised summer color that warns you something is building. I rolled t-shirts and socks into a duffel bag, while the box fan in my window clicked at every rotation. Mason kept walking past my room with friends, laughing too loudly, carrying pizza boxes upstairs, as if my sadness had improved the acoustics of the house. Before I zipped my bag, I took out the leather portfolio and the small wooden box from under my bed. I sat cross-legged on the carpet and untied the cord. Inside were 6 sketches on thick paper gone cream at the edges. One signed in pencil. There were notes in narrow slanted handwriting. and a folded envelope addressed to Ruth Holloway, my grandmother's maiden name. I didn't read all of it then. I just touched it. Not because I thought it was worth money, because it had passed through her hands. That was enough. I slid everything back into the portfolio and locked the brass latch on the box. Then I wrapped the box in my yellow quilt and pushed it farther under the bed. I remember whispering, "Stay there," as if objects can obey. At 5:30 the next morning, my mother drove me to the church parking lot. The sun had barely come up, and everything looked gray-blue and unfinished. Parents stood around holding travel mugs while camp counselors checked names off clipboards. Diesel fumes from the bus mixed with coffee, grass, and hot pavement from the day before. When I hugged my father goodbye, he patted my shoulder twice and said, "Try to have fun." My mother adjusted my camp lanyard and smiled for one of the other moms. Then, very softly, with lipstick barely dry, she said, "When you come back, let's start being less sentimental." I didn't know what she meant. I remember that almost as much as what happened after. Camp itself was exactly what most camps are. Vet towels, bug spray, cheap shampoo, girls whispering after lights out, canoes bumping against the dock at dawn, chapel songs in the morning air, the smell of lake water, pine needles, sunscreen, and mud heating under the sun. For the first few days, I was miserable. Then I got used to it. Then, around day 5, I laughed for real. There was a counselor named Hannah who wore mismatched socks and taught us how to identify constellations by lying on our backs in the grass after dark. One of the girls in my cabin snored so loudly, the whole room shook with silent laughter. I made a braided bracelet for a friend named Tori, who later cried because she said nobody had ever made something for her just because. That stayed with me. At 12, even then, I understood the difference between being tolerated and being chosen. On day 9, I wrote a letter home. I told my parents about canoe races and a girl who dropped her flashlight in the lake and blamed Satan. I told my father I had learned how to build a fire with damp wood. I told my mother the camp served peach cobbler that almost tasted like Grandma Ruth's, though not quite. I asked if my room had been hot during the storms. I asked if the maple tree had dropped any branches. I asked if they had watered the fern on my windowsill. No one wrote back. At camp, that wasn't unusual. Plenty of kids never got mail, so I told myself not to mind. Still, on the last day, while we loaded our duffel bags and hugged girls we would probably never see again, I remember feeling a strange nervousness in my stomach. Not dread exactly, just the sensation that the air had shifted somewhere far away and was waiting for me to walk back into it. My father picked me up alone. That should have told me something. He was never the one who picked me up from anything if my mother could avoid it. His car smelled like coffee gone stale in a travel mug and the faint tar scent that clung to his work shirts. He smiled when he saw me. But it was too quick. Too prepared. "You grow 2 inches?" he said. "No." "You look older." I put my duffel in the back seat and asked where Mom was. "At home." That was all he said. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Cornfields blurred by the windows. We passed a gas station. 2 grain silos. A stretch of road where the pavement always buckled in summer. I talked about camp for maybe 10 minutes before giving up. My father nodded in the wrong places. Every answer he gave me had the loose, delayed shape of a man rehearsing a smaller lie to cover a larger one. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the rental dumpster first. It stood near the garage with its metal sides scratched and rusted, half full of broken shelving, drywall scraps, black trash bags, and something pink I thought was insulation until I realized it was part of my old desk chair. I turned to my father. "What's that?" He swallowed. "We did a clean out." A clean out. Even now, decades later, I can feel the exact cold that spread through me in that July heat. I got out of the car before he had fully parked. The front door was open. I walked in with my camp bag still hanging from my shoulder. The house smelled wrong. Not like home. Like bleach. Paint. Cardboard. And fresh dust ripped out of corners. Nobody had the decency to leave alone. My mother came from the hallway holding a roll of shelf paper. "There you are," she said brightly. Not "hello," not "we missed you," not "I'm sorry." There you are. I looked past her and saw my room. Or rather, the space that had been my room. The wallpaper was gone. The blue flowers were stripped off the walls in ragged patches. My bed was gone. My bookshelves were gone. The quilt was gone. The window curtains were gone. The room had been painted a pale beige that looked like somebody had tried to remove the last trace of personality from the air. There was a new crib box leaning against the wall, and unopened cartons labeled "baby monitor," changing table, storage bins. I didn't understand. There are moments when your brain refuses the obvious because acceptance would be too fast, too violent, too complete. What happened? My mother set the shelf paper on the hall table. "We've been meaning to talk to you." My father stayed behind me. That was his specialty. To let women and children absorb the first impact while he stood just outside the blast radius, pretending that counted as restraint. What happened to my room? We decided. My mother said, in the voice she used when explaining rules to a waiter she disliked, that it was time to stop living in the past. I stared at her, then at the beige walls, then at the crib box, then back at her. "What happened to my room?" She sighed. "Elisa, lower your tone." I hadn't raised it yet. My father said, "Your Aunt Marjorie's staying with us a while." That landed second. Marjorie was my mother's younger sister. She had left her husband 2 months earlier and was 7 months pregnant. She had been moving between couches and spare rooms and long dramatic phone calls ever since. My mother had been obsessed with helping family, which in our house always meant helping the family members who generated the most chaos. "We're turning the room into a nursery," my mother said. I looked from one of them to the other, as if one of them might suddenly laugh and say, "Of course not." We moved some furniture. That's all. Instead, my mother folded her arms. "Your things were cluttering up the house," she said. "Half of it was childish junk. You're too old for most of it anyway." Something inside me made a sound I didn't hear with my ears. I dropped my duffel bag. "Where are my things?" "We sorted them." Sorted. My mother loved verbs that made cruelty sound administrative. "Where are they?" "We donated some, threw out what was broken, kept what mattered." I remember the hallway tipping. "What do you mean you kept what mattered?" My mother's expression hardened because the question challenged her authority, not because it described harm. "We are not doing this dramatically. Elisa." My books were in there. "We kept some books?" My grandmother's quilt was in there. It was old. My letters were in there. You do not need every scrap of paper you've ever touched. My box was under the bed. That made her blink. What box? The world narrowed. It was extraordinary how quickly grief can transform into terror when one specific thing comes into view. The wooden box, brass latch, ornament. My mother looked at my father. My father looked toward the kitchen. Mason, who had apparently been listening from the stairs because of course he had, leaned against the railing and said, "Oh, that ugly thing? I think Mom tossed it. I don't remember crossing the hallway. I only remember being suddenly at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at him with my entire body shaking. You touched it?" He shrugged. It looked like trash. It was mine. So was the room? He said. Then life changed. My mother snapped. Mason, enough. But not because what he said was cruel. Because he said it too plainly. I ran outside to the dumpster. The metal side burned my palms as I pulled myself up to look in. The smell hit me first. Paint dust. Stale trash. Wet cardboard. Sour heat. I saw broken lamp pieces. An old comforter. 2 black garbage bags split open. My stuffed rabbit with one ear torn off. A stack of magazines soaked through from rain. And part of the blue flower wallpaper rolled into itself like skin. I started digging. My father came out behind me and said my name once. Then again louder. I kept digging. I found one sneaker, a ruined sketch pad, a library tote, 3 books swollen with rainwater, the ceramic music box, cracked clean through the middle. No box. No quilt. No letters. No portfolio. I must have climbed halfway into the dumpster because I remember my father grabbing my arm and pulling me back down while I screamed at him not to touch me. It was the first time in my life I had ever screamed like that. Not cried. Not argued. Screamed. My mother stood on the back steps. Not coming closer, because proximity would have required responsibility. Neighbors could hear by then. I knew that I didn't care. You had no right. I said. My father kept saying, "We didn't know. We didn't know." And that is the sentence people use when what they mean is, "We did not bother to know." My mother said, "This reaction is exactly why we needed to break your attachment to things." That sentence changed my life more than the dumpster did. Because until then, some part of me had still believed there might be a misunderstanding, big enough to explain what happened. There wasn't. She had done it on purpose, not for money, not in panic, not by accident. On purpose, to teach me a lesson. I did not speak at dinner that night. My Aunt Marjorie cried at the table and said she felt awful and had not known my room would be cleared before I got back. My mother comforted her. Mason asked if there were still biscuits. My father said almost nothing. My seat had been moved. That part sounds small when I say it now. But it mattered. My old place at the table had become a corner spot near the kitchen doorway because the room needed to be rearranged for Marjorie's pregnancy cushions and drama. I sat there with the smell of roast chicken turning my stomach and realized there was not one visible sign in that house that I had ever had a room of my own. I slept that night on a fold-out cot in the basement. The sheets smelled like detergent and mildew. The basement window was set high in the concrete wall. So all I could see was the strip of night above ground level and the legs of people crossing the yard if they came close enough. I lay awake listening to the water heater click and cool. And I thought about my grandmother's hands tying the cord around that leather portfolio. I thought about the quilt. I thought about the little silver bracelet. I thought about my letters. I thought about all the versions of me that had been boxed up and judged disposable while I was away, singing camp songs about grace. At some point after midnight, I got up and went to the laundry sink. I threw up quietly. Then I washed my face with cold water and looked at myself in the small metal-framed mirror above the utility shelf. My eyes looked older. My mouth looked harder. There is a version of a person that exists before they understand they are not safe in their own family. I met the version after that night in the basement. The next morning, my mother acted cheerful. Cheerful. She made pancakes. She asked whether I wanted to help choose nursery curtains. She said this could be a wonderful reset if I let it. I remember thinking, with a clarity almost frightening for a 12-year-old, that she was not confused. She was strategic. She wanted me to agree to the story before I was old enough to defend myself from it. If I accepted the nursery, accepted the basement cot, accepted the loss as maturity, then one day she would be able to say, "You understood?" Even then. So I stopped crying in front of her. That was the real beginning. Not the camp, not the dumpster, not even the missing box. The real beginning was me understanding that any pain I displayed would be rewritten as proof of my instability. So I became disciplined, cold on the outside, careful, observant. I started keeping records. Not because I was dramatic, because I was learning from the best. I wrote down the date my room was cleared, the contents I could remember, the words my mother used, the fact that my father knew, the fact that Mason admitted seeing the box, the fact that my aunt cried and was comforted while I was treated like a behavioral issue for wanting my own life back. I didn't know yet what I would do with those records. I only knew I never wanted to feel that helpless again. That fall, I went back to school and did what quiet girls with fury often do. I excelled. I made myself useful to teachers. I learned to speak clearly. I stopped expecting rescue. I stopped confusing family with shelter. The guidance counselor who had encouraged camp noticed something had changed in me. "You seem older," she said one day. That was the second time someone had told me that in less than a month. I smiled and said I was fine. By then, I had learned how profitable that lie can be for everyone except the person telling it. The years after that did not turn cinematic all at once. This is important. People love stories where betrayal produces instant brilliance. It usually doesn't. It produces survival first. The glow-up comes much later, after a long, unimpressive season of carrying your own weight without applause. In high school, Mason got a car before I did, even though my grades were better and my behavior was spotless. My mother called it practical because he needed confidence. When I got my license, I inherited the family's old sedan with a stuck passenger door and no air conditioning. My father told me to be grateful. I was. Not to them. To the engine. Because unlike most people in my house, it did what it was supposed to do when asked. Marjorie moved out eventually with the baby. But I never got my room back. It became a guest room, then a storage room, then an office no one used. My mother said moving me upstairs again would make no sense after all that effort. All that effort, as if destruction were labor deserving respect. I stayed in the basement until I graduated. The basement made me practical. It also made me invisible. Friends rarely came over because there was nowhere to bring them without explanation. Boys from school assumed I was aloof. Teachers thought I was driven. The truth was simpler. I spent most of adolescence trying to become the kind of person no one could erase a second time. When college applications came around, my mother pushed local options. Community college. Something affordable. Something sensible. Something close enough that I could still be around to help. Help with what? Exactly. Was never clear. Mason, of course, was encouraged to dream bigger, despite a transcript that looked like a crime scene. I got scholarships. Plural. That surprised my mother more than it pleased her. I still remember the thin winter light coming through the kitchen window when I opened the letter from Ohio State and saw the financial package. My fingers went numb before the rest of me did. For one full minute, I let myself feel uncomplicated joy. Then my mother said, "Well, don't get carried away. Those places always find hidden costs." That was her gift. To turn every open door into a caution sign. I went anyway. And the day I moved into my dorm, I packed exactly one box labeled "Keep in Sight." I didn't let anyone else carry it. Inside were the few things that had survived the camp summer because they happened to be somewhere else at the time. One photo of Grandma Ruth. 3 letters I had left inside a school binder by accident. A charm from the bracelet that had broken off years earlier. And the written inventory I'd started the night my room disappeared. That inventory became something else in college. A map. I studied archival management first. Then museum studies. Then appraisal work almost by accident, because a professor noticed I had an obsessive memory for provenance. Conditions notes. Acquisition history. And the emotional life of objects. I wanted, more than anything, to understand how ordinary things become records, how a bowl becomes an heirloom, how a letter becomes evidence, how a sketch becomes a fortune, how the wrong family can look at history and see clutter. Maybe that sounds dramatic now. It didn't then. It felt practical. I worked. I interned. I cataloged estate collections in fluorescent back rooms that smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. I learned the difference between sentiment and documented value. I learned how often women's history gets mislabeled as domestic miscellany. I learned how many fortunes had once been tossed into donation bins because the wrong man in the room called something unimportant. And every so often, when I opened a brittle folio or identified a signature under bad lighting, I would think of the leather portfolio under my bed. Edwin Vale. My grandmother's warning. My mother's word. Things. By 24, I was living in Pittsburgh, renting a 3rd-floor apartment above a bakery that made the whole stairwell smell like butter at dawn. I had a job with a regional auction house as a junior catalog specialist. It paid badly. I loved it anyway. By 29, I had moved up. Not glamorous up, real up. The kind built from precision, long hours, and never making the same mistake twice. That was when my parents started trying to talk to me differently. Not warmly. Differently. My success confused them. Distance had also improved me in their eyes. Because distance let them enjoy my resume without enduring my memory. My mother began leaving voicemails that sounded performative even in private. "We're just so proud of the woman you've become." That sentence used to make my jaw ache. Because it pretended there had been no cost. It pretended women are built in sunlight. Not basements. Mason, meanwhile, stayed exactly the kind of man childhood had prepared him to be. Charming in short bursts, careless with money, full of explanations. He bounced through jobs and relationships and returned to my parents' house twice before 40. Each time announced as temporary, and each time treated like a perfectly understandable consequence of bad timing. I saw them at holidays when I could not avoid it. Every year. There were new versions of the same old choreography. My mother asking too many polished questions in front of other people. My father acting as though politeness were repair. Mason making little jokes to test whether I would react. As if cruelty were a radio signal, he still enjoyed checking for strength. By then, I almost never gave him what he wanted. Almost. Because here is the truth. No matter how successful you become, some wounds remain wired under the floorboards. People can spend 20 years becoming articulate, accomplished, independent, and still feel 12 again, when the right voice says the right thing in the old kitchen light. I had built a life, a good one, but I had not found the box, and I had never stopped wondering where it went. Not every day, not even every month, but enough. Enough that if I passed a donation warehouse or a church rummage sale or a shelf of anonymous estate lots, something in me would still tighten. Sometimes I imagined it destroyed. Sometimes I imagined it sitting in some stranger's attic. The portfolio foxed and yellowing in darkness. Sometimes I imagined my mother had seen the papers, understood nothing, and thrown them into a rain barrel with the certainty of a woman rearranging history to suit a room. I thought, with time, that uncertainty might be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was what happened 20 years later, when uncertainty ended, and that began on a wet Thursday in October, with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The call came in while I was reviewing a set of unsigned landscape studies from an estate outside Sewickley. Rain tapped against the office windows in a fine, steady rhythm, the kind that turns everything outside into a gray watercolor. My desk lamp threw a pool of warm light over the folder in front of me, and the air smelled like paper, coffee, and the faint metallic dust that old filing cabinets seem to exhale in every professional archive in America. I almost let the call go to voicemail because the number was unfamiliar. I answered because I was between lots and tired enough to make an uncharacteristic choice. "This is Eliza Warren." There was a pause. Then a woman said, "Ms. Warren. My name is Cynthia Bell. I'm calling from Bell and Mercer Estate Services in Columbus. I hope I'm not bothering you." Estate Services. Me hand stilled over the folder. "No, go ahead." We recently acquired a mixed consignment lot from a former storage liquidation partner. It included household papers, minor decorative objects, and some art material. One of our junior appraisers came across a handwritten note with the name Ruth Holloway on it. My grandmother's maiden name. Everything in my office went very quiet. I could still hear the rain, the hum of the vent, someone laughing faintly in the hallway. But inside me, silence. Cynthia kept speaking in the careful tone professionals use when they suspect they may be standing near somebody else's emotional landmine. "Your name appeared on a secondary note inside the bundle. We did some research. We found your work profile. Then a possible family connection. I realized this is unusual." I sat back in my chair. "What exactly did you find?" "A leather portfolio containing early commercial sketches, correspondence, and inventory notes attributed to Edwin Vale. There's also an envelope addressed to Ruth Holloway, and a partial ownership notation suggesting it remained in private hands." I closed my eyes. For a second, I was 12 again. crouched in the heat beside a dumpster, digging through rot for proof that I had not imagined my own life. Then I opened my eyes and became 42. Professional. Measured. Breathing. Can you send me images? Of course, she said quickly. There is one more thing. That phrase has never once improved a day. One sketch appears to match a work referenced in Vail's early exhibition ledger from 1958. If authenticated, the portfolio may have considerable market value, potentially very considerable. I said nothing, not because I hadn't heard her, because my body had divided cleanly in two. One half was all training, already building the checklist. Provenance, condition, chain of custody, known comparables, authentication sequence, legal standing. The other half was standing in a stripped bedroom staring at beige walls while her mother called grief clutter. Cynthia asked if I was still there. Yes. If you're willing, we'd like you to come in, given your background and the possible family link. We thought it best to proceed carefully. Carefully. At 12. No one had used that word around my life. At 42. It sounded holy. I told her I would drive down the next morning. Then I ended the call and sat perfectly still for so long that my colleague Jonah leaned around my office door and asked, "You okay?" I looked at him. Jonah was one of those decent men who never perform decency. He just practices it. Late 40s. Wire rim glasses. Kind eyes. Divorced once. 2 adult daughters he spoke about with quiet respect instead of ownership. I said slowly. Something that was stolen from me 20 years ago just surfaced in Columbus. He took that in. Do you want me to go with you? I almost said no out of habit. Then I didn't. Yes. He nodded once. Okay. No speech. No curiosity theater. No grabbing at the story before I was ready to hold it myself. Just okay. That night I barely slept. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I stood by my apartment window, watching rain bead on the glass, and thought about every possible variation of disappointment. Maybe it wasn't the full portfolio. Maybe it had water damage beyond recovery. Maybe the handwriting was misattributed. Maybe the papers were real, but the ownership trail had been corrupted beyond repair. Maybe the market value was inflated. Maybe the legal complications would swallow the emotional satisfaction whole. And beneath all of that ran the darker question. How had it survived? Because survival meant a path. And a path meant choices. Someone had kept it. Someone had sold it. Someone had handled what my mother called junk carefully enough for it to remain intact for 20 years. The next morning, I could have driven myself, but I was glad I didn't. October had turned the hills rust and copper, and wet leaves stuck to the highway in dark ribbons. The world outside the windshield kept changing shape, while inside the car I was locked inside one old image. Beige walls, missing quilt, empty shelves, my mother's face. Jonah didn't ask for the full story until we were almost to Columbus. Then he said, "Do you want to tell me, or do you want silence?" I looked out at a line of bare trees and said, "When I was 12, my parents cleared out my room while I was away at camp. Everything. They said I was too sentimental. There was a box under my bed from my grandmother. It had a leather portfolio in it. I've thought about it for 20 years. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. They knew what it was? No, that's almost worse. He glanced at me. Why worse? Because they didn't destroy value on purpose. I turned back to the window. They destroyed me carelessly. After that, silence felt earned. Bell and Mercer operated out of an old brick warehouse, converted into office suites and climate-controlled storage. It smelled like polished wood, toner, dust, and old paper. Cynthia Bell was in her 60s. Immaculate. With silver hair twisted low at the neck and the precise courtesy of a woman who had spent decades handling the collision between money and mourning. She led us into a viewing room. The portfolio sat on a felt-lined table beneath angled lights. I stopped 3 feet away. There it was. Dark brown leather, worn at the edges, one side slightly warped from age, the cord replaced, but the folio unmistakable. My grandmother's hand-labeled note still tucked inside the inner flap. For a moment, I could not breathe. I touched the table before I touched the portfolio, just to steady myself against something that wasn't memory. "Take your time," Cynthia said softly. My fingers trembled when I opened it. There were the sketches, the notes, the envelope to Ruth, and tucked behind the third sheet, folded in half, was something I had never seen before. A letter in my grandmother's handwriting, addressed to me, not mailed, not sealed, just tucked there, waiting where only the right hands would find it. My throat closed. I sat down. Cynthia moved farther back without being asked. Jonah stayed beside the wall, giving me room while refusing to vanish. I unfolded the letter with the care you use on things that have already survived one unnecessary death. Elisa, if you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either I have given this to you myself, as I intended, or the world has once again proved that important things survive despite the people around them. If it is the second, do not waste too much grief on that discovery. Some people have no eye for value unless a stranger prices it for them. Mr. Vale was kind to my parents when he had no reason to be. These sketches were left with us during a difficult winter and later returned, but he insisted we keep this early study and notes in gratitude after his first real success. Your great-grandfather wanted to sell them years later. I refused, not because I knew what they would be worth, but because I knew what it meant to preserve something before the world agreed it had worth. You, my girl, are much the same. If these papers ever matter in the marketplace, remember that markets are late to many truths. People, too. Keep what matters. Let fools prove themselves by what they discard. Love, Grandma Ruth. I read it twice, then a third time. By the end, tears had blurred the ink into a trembling blue-gray river. Cynthia quietly placed a box of tissues near my elbow. And I almost laughed, because some part of me still found it shocking when Care arrived without performance. When I could speak, I asked the question that mattered first. How did this get here? Cynthia opened a folder. That's the complicated part. The portfolio had surfaced inside a mixed storage lot acquired from the closure of a church-run donation warehouse in Franklin County. According to the chain they had reconstructed, a volunteer sorting overflow donations in the early 2000s set aside a small number of paper-based items that looked potentially valuable instead of routing them for shredding or resale by the pound. Those items were boxed and stored with sparse notes. Years later, when the church outsourced a facility clean-out, the boxes were transferred, mislabel it, forgotten again, and eventually folded into a liquidation consignment handled by Bell and Mercer's partner. Meaning this. A stranger had looked at what my family discarded and thought, maybe not. That simple. That life-changing. Cynthia slid several photocopied notes toward me. One was from a volunteer named Margaret Klein, dated 19 years earlier. Old portfolio found in donation intake with juvenile linens and household goods. Possible art papers. Set aside pending review. Juvenile linens. My quilt. I stared at the words until they doubled. Another note listed 2 attached textiles removed due to mildew. The quilt had likely been unsalvageable by then. Some losses still arrived late. I closed my eyes and nodded once. Because there are moments when grief becomes too detailed to survive outwardly. Then Cynthia moved to the next subject. We had an independent preliminary review done before calling you. If the veil attribution holds under full authentication, the signed study alone could command a 6-figure price, possibly more depending on exhibition, interest, and accompanying correspondence. Jonah let out a low breath behind me. I didn't. I felt nothing for a full 2 seconds. Then the number hit. Not because money rewrites childhood. It doesn't. But because there was an almost unbearable justice in this particular fact. The item my family had thrown away while lecturing me about maturity had survived long enough to become undeniable in the only language they had ever reliably respected. Value. I asked the next necessary question. What is my legal standing? Cynthia's mouth tightened the way honest professionals' mouths do, right before they say something unpleasant but useful. Potentially strong, but not automatic. Of course. The law, like families, enjoys complexity where clarity would be kinder. Because the portfolio had been discarded by members of my household while I was a minor, ownership questions could involve intent, abandonnement, guardianship authority, and documentary proof. But if I could establish that the portfolio was a distinct personal gift intended for me, and that it was removed without my informed consent, I might have a compelling claim. The letter from my grandmother helped. My own records might help. Any witness accounts? Old letters. Or surviving documentation would help more. Records. My pulse jumped. I still had the inventory. Not all the original pages. I had recopied portions in college after the first notebook degraded. But the details were there. Dates. Descriptions. Phrase. The camp timeline. The missing box. Mason's statement. My mother's words. I had built a private archive out of rage and discipline. For the first time in my life, rage and discipline were about to invoice someone. Cynthia gave me copies, and the number of a specialist attorney in provenance and estate disputes. Then she asked whether I wanted Bell and Mercer to hold the portfolio in secure custody pending resolution. Yes, I said immediately. There was no world in which I was taking it to my parents' house as a moral prop. No, if this reckoning happened, it would happen on adult ground. Outside the building, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet brick and leaves. Jonah and I stood near the car, while my whole body tried to catch up to the last 90 minutes. Well, he said gently, that was one hell of a Thursday. I laughed then. A sharp, startled sound. 6 figures. At least, apparently. My mother threw 6 figures into a church donation pile to teach me not to be sentimental. Jonah looked at me for a long moment. That isn't the sentence? Elisa. I frowned. It isn't? No. He leaned one arm on the car roof. The sentence is, Your family tried to erase you. And your grandmother still found a way to leave you something nobody could misname forever. That stayed with me. The legal process took 4 months. I wish I could tell you justice moved faster when the facts were that clean. It didn't. I hired the attorney Cynthia recommended. A woman named Priya Shah who had the unnerving gift of making complicated people feel both seen and strategically doomed. She read my notes. The letter. The chain of custody materials. And the preliminary appraisal. Then she looked up and said, "You did something very smart when you were 12. Cried in a dumpster? Documented the event?" That almost made me smile. Priya built the claim around several points. First, the portfolio was part of a set of belongings clearly associated with me and stored in my private room. Second, my grandmother's letter strongly indicated personal intent directed toward me. Third, I had contemporaneous records describing the removal and my objections. Fourth, the family's disposal had occurred without my knowledge while I was away. Fifth, their own later statements, if elicited properly, could establish they never assessed or understood the item's nature, which undermined any future story that they had preserved or inherited it responsibly. "We don't need them noble," Priya said. "We need them careless in exactly the way they were." That line almost felt like prayer. Then came the question I had been avoiding. Did I want to notify my parents before formal filing? No. Then yes. Then no again. In the end, I chose one controlled step. A letter. Not emotional. Not pleading. Not theatrical. A factual notice that an item removed from my belongings during the summer of 1996 had resurfaced and was now under review for authentication and ownership. Any claim they intended to make should be directed to counsel, not to me personally. We sent it certified. My mother called within 24 hours. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. She left a voicemail. "Elisa, I have no idea what this is about. But if this is more revisionist drama about that summer, I really think you need to let go of the past. Your father is very upset." Not I'm upset. Your father is upset. The old choreography. Transfer blame. Borrow authority. Minimize the injury. Pathologize the witness. Mason texted later that night. "If you're trying to shake money out of mom and dad over some old camp thing, that's insane." Camp thing. I stared at that phrase until I could feel my blood pressure in my neck. Then I forwarded the text to Priya. She replied 3 minutes later. "Excellent. Don't respond." My father called 2 days after that. I picked up. Not because I owed him access. Because I wanted to hear which version of cowardice he had chosen after 20 years. "Elisa." His voice sounded older, thinner. Men age most visibly. I think, in the distance between what they know and what they admit. "Yes?" A pause. "Your mother says lawyers are involved." "Yes?" Another pause. "I don't understand why this has to become all this." There it was. The ancient family hymn. Why are you making consequences so inconvenient for the people who caused them? I stood in my kitchen, one hand braced against the counter. "Dad, when I came home from camp, my room was gone." "I know." "My grandmother's box was gone." Silence. I have never once. I said, "Heard you say it was wrong?" His breath caught. Then he said the thing I think weak people say when they confuse regret with morality. We did what we thought was best at the time. I closed my eyes. No. Mom did what she wanted. Mason did what amused him. And you did what required the least courage. He whispered my name like it was too heavy for his mouth. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I'm done carrying your silence as if it were nuance. Then I hung up. Priya filed the claim the next week. That was when the real panic began. Because private denial is easy. Formal documents are harder to gaslight. My mother shifted strategies almost immediately. First, she claimed she had no memory of the specific box. Then she claimed all items in my room legally fell under parental management because I was a minor. Then she implied the portfolio might have originated from her side of the family and therefore belonged broadly to the family. Which was a fascinating position for someone who had thrown it in a donation pile with old linens. Priya was delighted. I haven't seen this much contradiction outside of reality television. She said. Mason, meanwhile, became useful in exactly the way selfish people often do under pressure. He talked too much. During preliminary calls, he made offhand comments about that ugly old box under her bed and Mom saying it was time to quit worshipping junk. Priya collected each statement like a jeweler sorting stones. Then, in December, we got the authentication report. The signed study was real. So were the notes. So was the correspondence. And the market estimate came in higher than Bell and Mercer's cautious early range. Insurance value approached $380,000 for the primary materials as a set. With exhibition and publication interest, likely to increase visibility, $380,000. I sat in Priya's office and stared at the report while winter light slanted across the glass wall behind her. Cars hissed over wet streets, 8 floors below. Somewhere in the building, a copier biped. Entire systems of adult life continued normally while my childhood split open on a legal desk. Priya folded her hands. You have leverage now? I didn't ask for leverage. No, she said. You asked for ownership? Leverage came free. A hearing was set for early February. Not a full public trial. A settlement conference first. With evidentiary review, because the valuation changed everyone's appetite for risk. Meaning we would all be in one room. I did not realize until that moment how much of my body had spent 20 years preparing for exactly that. The night before the conference, I barely slept again. Some people think revenge is hot. Rage, speeches, dramatic music. It isn't the truest revenge, in my experience, is often cold and administrative. A conference room, a stack of exhibits, a person who once dismissed your pain, now forced to sit upright while strangers assign language. Sequence. And value to what they did. That morning, I wore navy. Not black. I didn't want grief. Not white. I didn't want innocence. Navy. Structured. Calm. Adult. My hair was pinned back. Small gold earrings. No necklace. No distractions. The kind of woman my mother would once have praised in other people and feared in me. Jonah drove me downtown and squeezed my shoulder before I got out. Remember, he said, you don't owe anyone a softer version of the truth because they aged. I nodded. Inside. The conference room was colder than it needed to be. Long table. Carafe of coffee. Generic art on beige walls. Fluorescent lighting flattering no one. Which I took as a good omen. My parents were already there. So was Mason. I had not seen all three together in a legal setting before. And the first thing I noticed was not that they looked older. It was that they looked ordinary. For years, memory had enlarged them. My mother as force, my father as atmosphere, Mason as damage. Now they were just people under bad lighting. My mother wore a cream blazer, and the expression she reserved for church women, she intended to outperform politely. My father looked gray around the mouth. Mason had gained weight and lost charm, which improved the world slightly. They all stared when I entered. Good. Let them. Priya shook hands. Papers moved. The mediator introduced himself. Bell and Mercer's representative attended remotely for chain of custody confirmation. There was no dramatic music, just forms, exhibits, and the slow assembly of truth. My mother tried first. Elisa, she said. With a tremor so selective, I nearly admired it. I hate that it's come to this. I looked at her. You had 20 years to hate it before lawyers were involved. Her lips pressed thin. The mediator began. Timeline first. Summer of 1996. Minor child away at camp. Room cleared without notice. Personal belongings removed. Specific portfolio later surfaced through donation chain. Authentication established. Ownership disputed. Each sentence landed like a stone. Then came the exhibits. My handwritten inventory. My college copy with annotations. The volunteer note from the church warehouse. My grandmother's letter. Authentication report. Mason's text. Partial statements from calls. At one point, the mediator read aloud one line from my 12-year-old notes. Mom said, "This reaction is exactly why we needed to break your attachment to things." The room went still. My mother shifted in her chair. That sounds harsh out of context. Out of context. I almost laughed. Priya responded before I could. What context improves disposing of a child's private belongings while she is away without notice? My mother opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time in that room, I saw it. Not remorse. Calculation failing. Mason tried next. Because fools often mistake movement for strategy. Look. Nobody knew it was valuable. Priya turned to him. Thank you. That addresses one issue clearly. He frowned. Realizing too late, he had just handed her another clean brick for the wall. My father spoke only once during the first hour. He said, very quietly, "We did have a lot going on then." I looked at him. My voice, when it came, surprised even me. So did I. Not loud, not shaking, just true. That sentence changed the room. Because for the first time, I was not arguing as the wounded child in family memory. I was testifying as the adult authority on what happened to that child. The mediator asked whether the family wished to assert any personal claim over the portfolio beyond parental disposal authority. My mother straightened. Yes, it came from my side of the family. There it was. I turned toward her fully. And if I hadn't found it? She blinked. If it had stayed in that warehouse forever. I said, "Would you have ever once told me you threw away something from Grandma Ruth?" Her silence answered for her. So I kept going. You didn't preserve her memory. You discarded it. You don't get to become her daughter again, now that a market report exists. My mother flushed. Elisa, you are being cruel. No, cruel would have been waiting until I was 12, driving me to camp, and using those 2 weeks to erase all physical evidence that I had a private life. Cruel would have been calling grief clutter. Cruel would have been standing on back steps while your daughter climbed into a dumpster for her grandmother's last gifts. I didn't say all of that. I didn't need to, because by then, the room knew. The legal discussion turned practical after that. Bell and Mercer confirmed the recovery path. Cynthia's documentation made clear the portfolio had entered the donation stream with household goods inconsistent with intentional family preservation. Priya argued that abandonment by guardians of a minor's property under those circumstances did not confer moral or equitable ownership once the specific item was identified and claimed by the original intended recipient, especially where documentary evidence showed personal gift intent. The mediator asked whether settlement was possible if ownership transferred to me in full, with confidentiality terms. My mother's attorney requested a recess. We all stood. Coffee was poured. No one drank much of it. I moved to the window at the end of the hall and stared down at pedestrians crossing through dirty winter slush. My hands were steady. That amazed me. At 12, I had dug through trash for proof. At 42, I had records. Counsel. Authentication. And a grandmother still speaking from paper. People call that closure. It isn't. It's alignment. When the session resumed, the terms came quickly. My parents would withdraw claim in exchange for no public suit alleging intentional conversion beyond the resolved dispute. The portfolio and all related materials would transfer to me in full. No proceeds, now or future, would be shared with family members. Each party would bear its own costs, except for specified administrative fees. A narrow confidentiality clause would apply to valuation details, but not to my right to discuss the personal history in general terms. My mother hated that clause. I could tell. She wanted the kind of silence that protects image more than people. She didn't get it. Before papers were signed, the mediator asked whether anyone wished to make a final statement for the record. And then, because God occasionally has a sense of theater, my mother said, we did the best we could in a difficult season. There are lies so old, they no longer sound like speech. They sound like furniture being dragged across the same floor. I looked at the mediator, then at Priya, then at my parents. No? I said. No elaboration at first. Just no. Then I sat straighter and gave them what they had earned. You did what was easiest for yourselves and called it necessary. You made my grief into a character flaw because it was more convenient than treating me like a person. You threw away my belongings while I was gone because you knew it would be harder to do in front of me. And for 20 years, none of you came back for the truth until it had a price tag. My voice stayed calm. That mattered. Because calm truth frightens people more than tears when they know they deserve it. I looked at my father. You watched? Then Mason. You laughed. Then my mother. And you renamed all of it as parenting? Nobody interrupted. So I finished. I am not here for revenge. I am here because what was mine remained, mine even after you discarded it. That is the part you never understood. The value did not begin when strangers measured it. It began when Grandma Ruth put it aside and believed I would know the difference between clutter and inheritance. By the end, even the mediator looked like he needed better family boundaries. The papers were signed 22 minutes later. Outside. The February air cut clean across my face. The sky was a hard silver. My phone buzzed once with a confirmation email from Priya's office. Ownership transferred pending final release processing. That should have been the end. Legally. It was. Emotionally. Family endings rarely arrive in one clean scene. 2 weeks later, my father asked to meet. Not at their house. At a diner off Route 23, halfway between Old Habit and Cowardice. I almost refused. Then I accepted because there are some conversations you don't have for hope. You have them for clarity. The diner smelled like coffee, onions, and syrup, vinyl booths, fluorescent menus, a waitress who called everyone honey without discrimination. My father looked smaller somehow in that booth, as if age had finally reduced him to his exact emotional dimensions. He ordered decaf. I ordered tea. Fora minute. We both pretended to care about the weather. Then he looked at his hands and said, I should have stopped it. There it was. The sentence. 20 years late. I waited. He swallowed. I knew your mother was clearing the room. I didn't know about every item. But I knew enough. And I knew you'd be hurt. I told myself Marjorie needed the room. I told myself you'd adjust. I told myself your mother was under pressure. I told myself a lot of things. Yes? I said, you did. His eyes lifted to mine. I was weak. I let that sit. Not because I enjoyed it. Because he needed to hear the silence after the truth and understand that truth does not automatically produce absolution. He reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table. A photograph. It showed me at about 8 years old. Sitting on Grandma Ruth's porch steps with a book open in my lap and my knees dirty from the garden. My grandmother stood behind me with one hand on my shoulder, not smiling for the camera so much as standing guard over the moment. I found this in one of my old work files. He said, your mother must have shoved it in with tax papers years ago. I don't know if you want it. I picked it up carefully. The edges were soft, the color slightly faded. But there we were. Me and the one adult who had looked at me like I was already real. I want it, I said. He nodded. Then he ruined the moment a little by asking, is there any chance, after some time, things could be different? Families love vague verbs when they want access without accountability. Different how? Warmer? Easier? More available? Less honest? I set the photo down. Dad, I'm not interested in pretending we had a misunderstanding. He flinched. I know. No, I don't think you do. I leaned in slightly. You want a future that doesn't require you to hold the full shape of the past. I'm not building that for you. His eyes filled then, unexpectedly, and I felt something complicated and human and unspectacular. Not triumph. Not forgiveness. Just the weary recognition that a man had spent his life outsourcing courage and had finally discovered the bill came due anyway. I'm sorry, he whispered. I believe you, I said. That was as much as I had. And sometimes, as much as you have is the boundary. I did not meet my mother after that. She wrote a long email instead. It contained the usual ingredients: stress, family strain, different times. Regret if I felt hurt, her own difficult childhood, the impossibility of being perfect, the pain of being judged decades later by adult standards for choices made under pressure. Notice what was missing. Not one direct sentence naming what she did. No, I threw away your belongings. No, I erased your room. No, I was wrong. So I replied with 3 lines. I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be accurate. Until you can name what happened plainly. Distance is the healthiest relationship available to us. Then I blocked further debate. Mason never apologized. He did something more predictable. He asked for money. 3 months after the settlement, he called from an unknown number and launched into a story about a failed business deal. Temporary cash flow. Terrible timing. And how family should not let old resentments interfere with practical help. I listened all the way through because sometimes contempt deserves a full exhibit before dismissal. Then I said, the last time you showed interest in something that belonged to me, you helped throw it away. He started to speak. I ended the call. And that was that. As for the portfolio, I had choices. Sell, hold, donate, exhibit. For a while, I did nothing. I visited it twice in secure storage, and once at the conservation studio where a specialist stabilized the paper and removed old acidic backing from one sketch. Watching someone preserve those materials with patience and skill did something to me that therapy probably could have explained if I had wanted to spend that many hours narrating the basement. In the end, I sold 1 signed study and retained the rest. That single sale changed my financial life. I paid off my apartment, started a scholarship fund in Grandma Ruth's name for first-generation students pursuing archival studies, conservation, or museum work. And I bought one thing I had wanted since I was 17, and too practical to consider. A house. Not large. Not chauve. A brick row house with tall windows. Original built-ins. And a small fenced garden where the evening light turns gold in late summer. The first night I slept there, I walked through each room after midnight, touching the walls. Not because I feared they would vanish, but because for the first time, every room I entered belonged to a life nobody else could reorganize while I was gone. In the front study, I framed my grandmother's letter. Not the original. The original stays protected. A facsimile. But the words are there. Keep what matters. Let fools prove themselves by what they discard. The scholarship grew over time because other people, once they heard the broad outline, I wanted to contribute. Former students, archivists, a retired librarian. One woman who wrote me a note saying, "My family threw away my journals when I went to college. I thought I was the only one this happened to." That is the thing about stories like this. They are never only about the object. They are about permission. Permission to call harm by its right name, even when it came from family. Permission to admit that not all loss is accidental. Permission to stop treating endurance as the final form of virtue. A year after I bought the house, Cynthia Bell invited me to speak at a small fundraising event for preservation and estate literacy. She wanted a short talk about provenance, overlooked domestic archives, and why families so often misjudge the value of what they inherit. I agreed. Not because I enjoy podiums, because I enjoy accuracy in rooms that once rewarded performance. The audience was modest. Donors, appraisers, local historians, attorneys, museum volunteers, soft lighting, round tables, chicken, I barely tasted, a screen behind the podium with slides of letters, quilts, recipe books, and sketch studies that survived because somebody in the chain had paused before discarding them. I spoke for 19 minutes. I talked about provenance and prejudice, about how many objects associated with women, children, and domestic life get mislabeled as sentimental clutter before being reclassified as culture once institutions bless them. I talked about documentation, about volunteer Margaret Klein writing maybe not on a note 19 years ago and changing the direction of my life without ever knowing my name. Then I said this: the most dangerous word in family systems is often just, it was just a box, just papers, just a child's room, just a difficult season, just trying to help, just clutter. But people disappear inside that word. So do histories. So do children. The room went quiet. Not polite quiet. Real quiet. I finished with my grandmother's line about markets being late to many truths. Afterward, people came up to thank me. One conservator cried. An attorney asked whether he could support the scholarship. A woman in pearls told me she had gone home last year and rescued her mother's recipe cards from a trash bag because she suddenly understood they were the only handwriting left. Then, near the back of the room, I saw my mother. Of course. Someone had invited a regional donor circle. She had come as a guest of a church acquaintance, not knowing I was the speaker. Or maybe knowing and hoping proximity would rewrite narrative. With my mother, either was possible. She stood there in a dark coat, one hand gripping her handbag too tightly. For one suspended second, 20 versions of my life overlapped. Basement cot, beige vals, dumpster heat, legal table, grandma's letter in my hands. Then only one remained. This one. I'll do it. Upright. Saying. My mother stepped toward me. Elisa. I looked at her. No tremor. No adrenaline storm. Just recognition. You spoke beautifully, she said. I nodded once. Thank you. She waited, perhaps expecting an opening. When none came, she lowered her voice. I'm trying. There are people for whom trying is a bridge. And people for whom trying is a performance review. They award themselves for minimal movement toward the truth. Then keep trying, I said, privately. Her face changed. Not with rage, with the tiny, startled pain of a person realizing there would be no public reconciliation scene to restore her image. Good. Some endings should remain unspectacular. They all think I'm a monster, she whispered. And there, in one sentence, she finally revealed what had always mattered most. Not what happened to me. What people thought of her. I held her gaze. I think you made a monstrous choice, I said calmly. Those are not the same thing. What happens next is up to you. Then I stepped around her and went to thank the volunteer coordinator. I did not look back. That was the public confrontation. If you need one. Not shouting. Not humiliation theater. A room full of witnesses, truth in complete sentences, and a woman who once erased my childhood learning that she no longer controlled the story just because she controlled the house. These days, people sometimes ask whether I forgave my family. The answer disappoints them because it isn't cinematic. I forgave some expectations. I forgave the idea that my mother would someday become the kind of woman I needed at 12. I forgave the fantasy that my father's apology would restore the years his silence shaped. I forgave myself for taking so long to stop hoping the truth alone would make everyone noble. But forgiveness, as a return policy on access? No, I have lunch with my father twice a year. Public places, short duration, honest weather. He is gentler now, though gentleness in old age is no substitute for courage when it mattered. Still, I let him try in the only direction left. He asks about the scholarship. He brought me a clipping once when a local paper mentioned it. I thanked him. My mother and I exchanged nothing except the occasional necessary message when someone is hospitalized or dead. That sounds colder than it feels. Distance, in some relationships, is the warmest thing left that does not burn both people alive. As for Mason, I hear about him through the vague family grapevine that still insists on existing even after trust dies. Another failed venture. Another girlfriend. Another story where bad luck plays lead and accountability misses the casting call entirely. He remains what happens when a child is overprotected from consequence until consequence grows large enough to become a life. Sometimes I think about the quilt. Not often. But sometimes in damp weather, or when folding clean linens, or when I open the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, where I now keep the photo of Grandma Ruth and a copy of her letter and a few other things that are mine because I say so. I think about the note from the church volunteer that mentioned mildew and textiles removed, and I let myself mourn that yellow quilt properly now. Not because it was expensive, because it was touched, because it held afternoons and fever naps and my grandmother's mending and the smell of her house. Because some things are priceless in ways markets cannot help with. That is another truth I learned too late, and just in time. The portfolio did not heal my childhood. Money did not sanctify my pain. Public truth did not turn my mother tender. None of that happened. What happened was simpler, and, to me, more important. Something they discarded returned. And when it did, I was finally old enough, prepared enough, and finished enough with minimizing myself to claim it without asking permission from the people who taught me I needed it. That is the real fortune, if I'm honest. Not the appraisal, not the sale, not even the house. The fortune was this. They failed. Not at throwing things away. They succeeded at that. They failed at defining what was worthless. And once I understood that, the entire architecture of my life changed. So if you are listening to this with your own version of the beige room somewhere inside you, here's what I want to leave you with. Keep records. Keep names. Keep the truth in language so plain that even time cannot make it decorative. Do not hand your memory to people who benefit from your confusion. And never let someone else's inability to recognize value become the measure of what you protect. Because markets are late to many truths. Families too. But late is not the same as never. And sometimes, 20 years after somebody throws away your life in black trash bags and calls it necessary, the world hands one piece back and says, "Here, we found this. It was always yours."